7 months. That's how long I plan to spend on the road. A solo journey across 5,300 miles of the United States. Just me, my bike, and the endless stretch of possibilities. For most, that kind of solitude might sound liberating, but for me, it turned into something else entirely. A nightmare I never asked for. It was mid-November in southern Washington. The weather was crisp, with an overcast sky pressing down on the landscape like a suffocating blanket. I had been pedaling all day, weaving through quiet highways flanked by towering evergreens and empty fields. The kind of environment where you feel small, a speck swallowed by nature's indifference. My stomach started to ache sometime in the afternoon. At first, I brushed it off as fatigue. After all, pedaling 80 pounds of gear every day was bound to take a toll on the body. But as the hours dragged on, the pain intensified. Still, I pushed forward, finding a secluded spot to set up camp before nightfall. The clearing was perfect, hidden from the road by a thick cluster of trees. I pitched my tent, performed my usual bedtime rituals of writing in my journal and brushing my teeth, and crawled into my sleeping bag. But tonight felt different. My appetite, usually ravenous, had vanished. Something was off, and the sinking feeling in my gut wasn't just from the stomachache. As darkness enveloped the woods, the quiet became oppressive. Every creak of the trees, every rustle of the leaves felt magnified. Lying in the pitch-black tent, my stomach churned violently. The nausea came in waves, each stronger than the last. By 11:30, I couldn't hold it back any longer. I unzipped the tent just in time to vomit into the dirt. I rinsed my mouth with the dwindling water supply from my bottles and lay back down, hoping that would be the end of it. But the night had other plans. 2 hours later, the nausea returned, more aggressive this time. By 2:30, I was vomiting again, each heave leaving me weaker, more drained. And at 4:30, though I didn't throw up again, the nausea kept me awake, taunting me with its persistence. I'd never felt so helpless, alone in the middle of nowhere, with no way to call for help if things took a turn for the worse. As I waited for sunrise, shivering and dehydrated, I planned my next move. There was a town 30 miles away, and I knew I needed to reach it. My water was gone, and my body was on the verge of collapse. At first light, the patter of rain began against the tent, light enough to be a nuisance, but not enough to delay my departure. When the rain stopped, I packed up and pushed my bike back onto the road. But something felt wrong. A quick inspection revealed a flat tire. Of course, my hands trembled as I worked on the repair, the cold biting into my fingers and the nausea clouding my focus. By the time I finished, the rain had returned, heavier this time. There was no choice but to press on. The ride was excruciating. Each pedal stroke felt like climbing a mountain, my legs burning with every movement. The rain soaked through my clothes, chilling me to the bone. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but the thought of food made me gag. And the dehydration was the worst. My lips cracked, and my throat felt like sandpaper with every shallow breath. By the time I rolled into the town, I was a shell of myself. I stumbled into a grocery store, grabbing bland, easy-to-digest food before heading to the motel. The receptionist took one look at me and let me check in early. I barely managed to shower before collapsing into bed, where I slept for 13 hours straight. The next morning, I felt marginally better, weak but functional. I decided to press on to the next major city, 60 miles away. The ride was long but uneventful, and I arrived just before nightfall. Feeling optimistic, I treated myself to a small museum visit the following day. That's when the nightmare escalated. Midway through the exhibit, the cramping returned a sharp, relentless pain that doubled me over. Sweating and trembling, I rushed back to the hostel, locking myself in the bathroom. For the next 24 hours, I was a prisoner to my own body, the food poisoning making its final stand. But it wasn't just the physical torment. That night, as I lay in bed, I began to hear things, faint whispers, like someone speaking just out of earshot. The sound of footsteps pacing outside my door. I told myself it was just the exhaustion, the dehydration playing tricks on my mind, until the door handle jiggled. I froze. The door was locked, but the sound of the handle turning sent a wave of cold terror through me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. Just the handle jiggling again, more aggressively this time. Grabbing my phone, I turned on the flashlight and approached the door. The footsteps retreated down the hallway, but when I peeked outside, the corridor was empty. The hostel was eerily silent, too silent. Over the next few hours, the whispers continued. Sometimes from outside the window, sometimes from the corner of the room. Shadows danced in my peripheral vision, vanishing the moment I turned to look. Was it the sickness, or was something else at play? By the time morning came, I was ready to leave. I packed my things hurriedly, glancing over my shoulder at every sound. As I stepped outside, I noticed something chilling. Scratched into the wooden frame of the hostel door, right where I'd been staying, were the words, "You can't run forever." My blood ran cold. I didn't wait to check out. I just got on my bike and pedaled as fast as my body would allow. Was it just my mind, weakened by food poisoning and exhaustion, or was something else watching me out there on the road? One thing's for sure, that trip changed me, and not just because of the miles I covered. It's because of the miles I'll never forget. I was 6 years old when I first learned that the woods have secrets, dark, terrifying secrets. It all started on a family camping trip, one that should have been filled with s'mores, laughter, and stories by the fire. But instead, it became the stuff of my childhood nightmares. The crackling campfire lit up our small group, my mom and dad, my aunt and uncle, and a couple of my cousins. The air smelled of pine and grilled hot dogs, and the distant hoot of an owl echoed in the night. We were deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway. But then, as the fire burned low, my uncle leaned in with a mischievous grin. "I've got a bedtime story for you," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He grabbed a flashlight, shining it upward to cast eerie shadows across his face. "Ever heard of the teddy bear's picnic?" he asked. Before I could answer, he began to sing in a low, haunting tone. "If you go down in the woods today, you're sure of a big surprise. If you go down in the woods today, you'd better go in disguise." His voice sent chills down my spine. As he continued, he scratched at the air and dragged his fingernails down the rough bark of a nearby tree. The sound was unnerving, like claws scraping against a chalkboard. The other adults chuckled, but I was frozen, clutching my knees to my chest. That night, the song replayed in my head as I lay in the tent between my mom and dad. The woods outside were pitch black, the kind of dark where even shadows seemed to disappear. Every rustle of leaves and snap of a twig felt amplified, as if something or someone was creeping closer. Then I heard it, a faint sound, like something scratching at the fabric of the tent. My breath hitched, and I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But then came the footsteps, soft at first but deliberate. They circled the tent, stopping and starting as though whatever was out there was watching us. My mom screamed suddenly, and I bolted upright. "It's just bats," she said. trying to calm herself and me, but I could see the tension in her face. My dad, trying to reassure me, pulled out a hunting knife and placed it beside him. "Just in case," he said with a wink, but it didn't help. I stayed awake all night, clutching my sleeping bag and staring at the tent ceiling, waiting for something to happen. The next day, I tried to shake off the fear. We hiked, roasted marshmallows, and played games, but I couldn't stop glancing at the tree line. I felt watched, like the woods were alive and waiting. That evening, my uncle started again. "You liked the song last night, didn't you?" he teased. Before I could protest, he started singing again, slower this time. "For every bear that ever there was will gather there for certain, because today's the day the teddy bears have their picnic." His voice was deep and menacing, and he made growling sounds, pretending to claw at the air. Everyone laughed, but I felt cold dread wash over me. That night, the same scratching and footsteps returned, only this time they were louder, closer. By the third night, I was a wreck. My uncle sang the song again, this time adding strange pauses and eerie growls between verses. When bedtime came, I begged my parents not to make me sleep in the tent, but they brushed it off as a childish fear. That night, I heard something heavy breathing outside the tent. The footsteps were no longer careful. They were bold, circling the tent and brushing against the fabric. Then, the tent shook violently, as if something massive had shoved it. I screamed and my dad jumped up, knife in hand, unzipping the tent to confront whatever was outside. There was nothing there, but as I peeked out, I saw claw marks on the tree trunks nearby. Deep, jagged marks that hadn't been there before. After that trip, I refused to go camping. The mere thought of the woods sent me into a panic. My uncle, realizing he had taken the joke too far, tried to make amends, but the damage was done. I spent years haunted by the song, by the memory of those footsteps and the feeling that something was out there watching. Years later, when I was about 12, I finally agreed to go camping again. My family had planned another trip, and I didn't want to seem like a coward. The first night was uneventful, and I started to think that maybe I had imagined everything as a kid. But on the second night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate footsteps. My blood ran cold as the memories came flooding back. I grabbed a flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the beam into the darkness. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw them. Two glowing eyes, low to the ground. They didn't belong to any animal I'd ever seen. The creature, or whatever it was, growled low and deep. It took a step forward, and I saw its silhouette, hunched, massive, and unnatural. I screamed, and the thing bolted into the woods, disappearing into the night. My parents woke up and tried to calm me down, but I knew what I saw. Something had been out there all along, and it wasn't just my imagination. Closure. It took years for me to confront my fear of the woods. Even now, as an adult, I can't hear the teddy bear's picnic without feeling a chill run down my spine. I've grown to love camping again, but I'll never forget the terror of that trip, or the feeling that something unexplainable was lurking just beyond the light of the fire. Some things are better left in the dark.